Well, South Africa's G20 Summit has been described as a resounding success. President Cyril Ramaphosa closed the G20 Summit with a message of unity and partnership in dealing with global problems. Ramaphosa says the G20 Summit Leaders Declaration, adopted in South Africa, is a commitment to improve the lives of the poor and vulnerable people across the world. Now, the 30-page document is called for the reform of the international financial system, inclusive growth, and the reduction of inequality, among others. Ramaphosa said the first ever G20 summit in the continent must help to accelerate progress towards the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. For more on this, let's have a conversation with South Africa's G20 Deputy Sherpa Ambassador, Xolisa Mabhongo. Ambassador, absolute pleasure to have you, but let me begin by congratulating Team South Africa on what I think has been unanimously described as a very, very successful gathering.
We are very pleased with the success of the summit. It reaffirmed a commitment by world leaders to work together to affirm multilateralism and cooperation in addressing some of the world's most pressing challenges. So Team South Africa is indeed pleased with the success of the summit.
Yeah, indeed it has. And as you have, constantly said, this has been hard work. This has been 2 years of hard work. This hasn't necessarily just happened overnight. Obviously, all eyes focusing over this last weekend, but the work that has been tirelessly done behind the scenes. Perhaps you want to give us a little glimpse into that and how we actually got to that declaration.
So we started the preparations in 2024 for the summit. Remember, it was very important to look at a number of important variables. For example, what was going to be the date of our summit. If you look at 2025, there were so many summits. For example, recently there was a meeting of the APEC in South Korea. There was a meeting of ASEAN in Malaysia. There were so many summits this year. So just deciding on a date, you have to do this a year in advance in cooperation with other countries who will be hosting summits in the same time, so that you can make sure that world leaders are able to move seamlessly between one summit to the other. And also just before our summit, 2 weeks before our summit, there was the COP of the climate change in Brazil. So some of the leaders who were here in South Africa also were in Brazil for the COP of the climate change. So you have got to take all those things into account, and you have got to decide on those dates a year in advance. So it looks like a simple process, but it's actually very complex. And then, of course, you have got to decide on the theme of the summit. Again, the theme, you decided well in advance based on how you read the world. So we sat back as South Africa and we looked at the challenges that are facing the world. And of course, the summit has got to also to resonate with your own population. So we also looked at the pressing challenges that are facing South Africans. So the whole question of inequality, joblessness, and other challenges that are facing our country, so that this summit must respond to the needs of South Africans. But of course, this was also the first summit on the African soil. So we also had to take that into account and say, then how do we bring the African dimension into the summit process? As President Ramaphosa noted on Saturday evening, it is the first time ever that in a G20 summit declaration, you have the word Africa appearing over 80 times. So we had to, as part of the preparations, look at this very broadly. Hence, it took us a year to prepare. And then, of course, this year we had then to conduct 133 meetings, inclusive of the summit. And these meetings were held all over the country in the 9 provinces. And so you had to involve the provinces, the local communities. So this was the type of planning that went into the preparations for the summit. Hence, we had to start back in 2024.
So this, I must say, the amount of work that's been done, and I think it's a very, very historic and proud moment for South Africa, but also for the continent. To have Africa under the spotlight finally is so imperative and so important. But I think a question that a lot of people ask, though, yes, it's all happened. Yes, it's great. Yes, it's on a piece of paper. The declaration is there. The commitment is there. But this isn't a binding declaration. So, as much as we feel like, this has been spoken about, there's been great decisions, but in terms of action, in terms of actionable, tangible feelings of how things are going to change the trajectory of a normal South African or a normal person living on the African continent, are you confident that there will be a difference?
I believe there will be a difference. Some of the decisions taken as reflected in the Johannesburg Declaration are quite concrete. For example, one of the biggest conversations that is taking place around the world is on the importance of critical minerals and how we manage these projects on critical minerals. And what we adopted as a G20 is what we refer to as a critical minerals framework of the G20. And we had yesterday in session 3 of the summit, many of the leaders speaking and actually commending South Africa for coming up with this idea of a critical minerals framework. So what this means is that we've set out a framework for managing critical minerals that really speaks to the concerns of the African continent, that really speaks to the concerns of some of the countries of the South that are the major producers of critical minerals, to say, how do we invest on local production? How do we invest on exploration? How do we ensure that there's beneficiation at source? How do we ensure that the local communities where these critical minerals are being produced benefit? So the G20 has therefore agreed on this very important framework, which was widely accepted in the speeches of some of the world leaders. That is just one element. Another priority that we set out was on disaster risk reduction. Again, the G20 members have again committed themselves, firstly, on investing more on disaster risk reduction, on ensuring that the private sector, the governments, philanthropies, and others come together to finance disaster risk reduction, to help countries with early warnings. Some of the disasters that we are dealing with as the international community, especially those that are induced by climate change, there's really not much that we can do about them, but the scale and intensity keeps getting higher. We feel this in South Africa through the floods in some parts of our country, just the changing nature of the climate, summers becoming hotter, winters becoming colder. So this is something that affects an ordinary South African, an ordinary person on the African continent. And what we have come out here to say, how do we invest in early warnings? How do we invest generally in the whole process of managing disasters? So we believe that there is a lot that can be implemented from the Johannesburg Declaration. Yes, the G20 is not a binding organization, but it has proven itself over the years that it can respond to major crises that are facing the world. We saw the G20, for example, in action during COVID, taking concrete decisions that were then implemented by all countries. So we are hopeful that there is but of course there is a lot that we will need to do to study the declaration, map out all the areas of implementation. There is also going to be a role for international organizations. For example, when we talk about the Artificial Intelligence for Africa program, that is one of our deliverables of our G20 presidency. Yeah. We have to work with international organizations such as UNESCO, such as the International Telecoms Union, and many others to say, how do we make this concrete? How do we ensure that the capacity building for AI in the African continent, as envisaged in the Johannesburg Declaration, is actually implemented? So we are hopeful, and we will be working hard because this is our legacy. It is in our interest as South Africa to ensure that there is implementation.
All right, let's talk debt, because this is something that I want to focus on a little bit, because there's a few things that I know that there were major victories, and we understand that. But let's speak a little bit about those areas that perhaps are, ones that we need to look at a little bit closer, and debt being one of them. So obviously there's been very strong language on debt transparency, crisis resilient debt clauses, new support mechanisms for low income countries. What is different, though, if I may ask you to highlight that. When we look back at previous G20 commitments, what is genuinely new that stands out for you?
So first of all, I mean, on the issue of debt, it is one of the major problems that is facing the world because we know now that over 30 countries on the African continent pay more on debt service costs than they do on paying for education and health. And of course, this is not sustainable. And many world leaders who spoke over the weekend in Johannesburg made this very clear that there's no society that can prosper and move forward without investing on health and on education. It is estimated that this year alone, Africa will pay about 89 billion US dollars just on debt service costs. So this is really not sustainable. So what we sought to do with our presidency was really to move the needle, to say, firstly, let's start with the existing mechanisms. For example, the common framework that is already existing under the auspices of the international financial institutions that are based in Washington. It is already there. It has been helping countries, especially some African countries have benefited from it. However, the conversation has been that we need to do more. The common framework, for example, needs to be made more flexible so that it can work faster in assisting countries. It should not be that a country that is in debt distress, once they get into the mechanism of the common framework, it takes a year, 2, 3 years just to negotiate debt clauses for that particular country. So these are the conversations of saying, okay, how do we then move this forward to make sure, and I think from Johannesburg, there is a commitment. But the other thing that South Africa has done is to really place the issue of debt and the cost of capital in a broader framework of inequality. As you know, President Ramaphosa instituted this extraordinary committee on inequality that was chaired by Professor Stiglitz.
Yeah.
And they came out with a report. This has also been presented to the summit. And it makes very pertinent points that firstly, inequality is a policy choice. That inequality is a threat to democracy and to the democratic processes. But it also makes a very strong case that addressing inequality is actually good economics for any country. And that's where the link is with the issue of debt. So by helping the countries that are in debt distress, the international community benefits, the people living in those countries benefit. So that is basically the nature of the discussions that we've had on debt. So we believe that our summit has indeed contributed to moving the needle a little bit on the issue of debt.
One can only hope, but I suppose one of the things that I perhaps may be the most sort of I don't know, ambitious things that have come out of this declaration is, of course, the whole issue around funding and the financial mechanisms. So I want to quiz you around this. I mean, where is the money going to come from for this debt relief that you speak about, for energy transitions, for food security, for climate resilience? I mean, you know, all of this is sort of, I suppose, the issue that now needs to be spoken to ad nauseum. And where does private sector mobilization come into this, and are they doing enough?
Well, I think what we see with many of the issues that we are discussing and the challenges that are facing the world, clearly we have to collaborate as the public sector with the private sector and others and look at creative ways of raising the funding. And I think there's already quite a lot of mechanisms that are out there. For example, when we are talking about debt, already we're talking about debt swaps, climate debt swaps, and they were also talking about investments, where some of the countries, for example, who are owed by some of this debt by developing countries, are actually converting that debt into investment projects in those same countries. So debt swaps are up there, and there's quite a big appreciation of the fact that using debt swaps can actually be a contribution and raise some of the funding. But we're also looking at other mechanisms, blended financing, for example, also using the normal official development assistance as a catalyst for raising more funds. But most importantly, we are also having a lot of conversations, even as developing countries, about domestic resource mobilization. And this was one of the themes of the summit when it comes to financing. When we talk about domestic resource mobilization, it is very important because at the end of the day, first and foremost, a country should be able to fund its own programs. But we are facing a situation, for example, where many countries struggle with domestic resource mobilization due, for example, to capacity to collect taxes, capacity to manage data. So this is part of the conversation. So it's not only that developing countries or countries of the African continent are expecting largesse to come from other countries, but we're also focusing on domestic resource mobilization. Again, very importantly, one of the conversations that we had in the summit is on the illicit financial flows. Indeed. As you know, Africa loses more than 80 billion a year through to illicit financial flows. And again, this is linked to capacity because some of the money that is leaving the African continent illicitly is because of some actors taking advantage of the fact that we don't have capacity for data, we don't have strong institutions to collect tax, and so on and so on. So we're looking at the issue of funding. It is complex, but we have to look at it comprehensively and look at it from all sources. And for example, on the illicit financial flows, from the South African presidency, we have agreed on a 3-year roadmap where we will really have a program which we hope that the whole international community will buy into. So this is one of the clear legacies of our presidency. Once we set out and articulate the 3-year program that has been agreed, we believe that at the end of this, we will have a better way of managing illicit financial flows, both from the perspective of the African countries, but also from the perspective of the countries who are recipients of these illicit financial flows.
And that's exactly what I was going to say, is that you need that commitment from the major economies who are seated at that table right there with you. There are so many things I want to talk about. I wanted to talk about conflict and the language that was really used, because you talk about the fact that, you know, there's a call for peace in places like Sudan, DRC, Gaza, and the Ukraine, amongst others, but there's still no avoidance in naming the aggressors and the steps that are going to happen, and the issue of migration, how that's going to work in this world where, you know, things are changing very, very fast and furiously. But as we head towards I've got 1 minute left. The future presidency and, of course, the handing over of this declaration has been something that there's been a lot of talk of, because obviously the United States is now officially leading and taking over as the presidency. Do we have any update there? We know that it'll be handed over at DIRCO to a like official. Are there updates? Have you heard from the US with regard to what's been adopted and what is contained in this declaration?
Well, we expect that there will be a meeting at DIRCO with the United States Embassy in Pretoria. That will take place tomorrow. So I think this will be a meeting where we will be able to share with the US our own experience and perhaps provide some tips, as it was done to us, for example, by Brazil. So we hope that this will be a constructive and fruitful meeting, and DIRCO is ready and prepared for this meeting. Let me make the point that each G20 presidency sets an agenda for the year. So South Africa set an agenda for the year around the 4 priorities, as I have described them earlier. So we expect then that from the 1st of December, when the United States becomes officially the presidency of the G20, they will then announce to the world what the priorities are for their presidency.
Right, we leave it there. Well done again. Thank you for your time. Thanks for outlining some of these issues. I know they'll be thrashed out a lot more as we get that post-analysis happening of the G20 and that whole closing that was happened yesterday. And a big double thumbs up to South Africa from most of the leaders that attended, really having a very, very good, just a good lot to say about how South Africa did this. Xolisa Mabhongo, who is South Africa's G20 Deputy Sherpa Ambassador, speaking about the South Africa G20 Summit that ended yesterday. Okay.